everybody, and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to look at UK devolution. So this is something that's developed since the Labour government from 1997 and has got a large degrees of controversy in parts of it, and we'll look at some of the debates as we go through, and then there'll be further videos that will pick up onto more of these in more detail. So this is from the Edexcel spec in component 2, aspect 1.3, the role and powers of the devolved bodies in the UK and the impact of this devolution on the UK. So we're going to look at devolution in England with Scottish Parliament and Government, Welsh Assembly and Government, and Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive. The Welsh Assembly has changed its name to the Welsh Parliament in the time since the spec was written, so we'll talk about that as well. So essentially what I'm looking at today is the bare bones, the basic structures of devolution and what has happened, and a few bits of the debate and argument going through, and to try and pick up on this idea of impact. And that major impact of that is going to be the powers that these devolved organisations have taken away from central government. So devolution in England is really a very kind of mixed picture. So we're going to look at regional devolution to start off with. Now, the first thing, as I say, it's not uniform. This leads to a huge amount of variation and inconsistency. To start off with, the Labour government created the regional development agencies, and these are looking at in terms of developing regional economic strategies and economic power. They then proposed regional assemblies. The idea of this is these would have looked a bit like, for example, the Welsh Assembly that had been created in Wales, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. But the idea was rejected in the North East in 2004 with a really strong statement with a 78% no vote, and therefore no further attempts were made in other regions. And they thought that the North East and then Yorkshire and the North West, these were areas that would have the kind of the strongest kind of regional identity, and therefore would have been most likely to take it on board. So when it fell at the first hurdle, it kind of fell away. Now, once Labour were no longer in power, the coalition and Conservative governments talked about the Northern Powerhouse as a favourite phrase of George Osborne, who was then Chancellor, and talks about improved transport links and investment in science and innovation. So regionalism, but not in terms of direct government. Now, the idea that grew up in government was the idea of new city regions with elected metro mayors. So the power of these vary, but they do have a degree of control within their own city region. And this comes to the fore during the COVID crisis, notably Andy Burnham in Manchester, and then also in Liverpool as well. There are only 7 of these these city regions that have been created. Now, other towns and cities have elected mayors, but some have scrapped the idea actually since it was first set up, such as Stoke and Hartlepool, whilst Doncaster and others have retained them, but they've had fairly bumpy rides. So part of the problem with regionalism and regional government in terms of devolution around England is that, as I've shown, it's not consistent, and therefore its impact is inconsistent as well. Now, one area that's seen the greatest level of devolution in England is London. So it has a directly elected mayor, the Mayor of London. It also has a directly elected assembly made up of 25 members. So the mayor and the assembly have power over policing, transport and economic development in London. Now, obviously, when you're talking about a city with a population of getting on for 10 million, this is really, really significant. And this means that London mayors become significant political figures. So, for example, Ken Livingstone, a highly controversial Labour London mayor, introduced a congestion charge. Boris Johnson is a former London mayor. The current London mayor is Sadiq Khan. Now, he's clashed with government over issues to do with COVID and in other areas, and he's even clashed with the US President Trump, who has been known to tweet strong things against him. So we see a kind of an impact here in terms of creation of another power base and a potential launching pad for political leadership through a party, through having held a power in London. Now, another element of devolution in England is the idea of English votes for English laws, which abbreviates nicely to EVIL. Now, devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland has got a degree of democratic inequality and has raised what is known as the West Lothian question. This was first actually raised back in the 1970s when devolution was first spoken about. And essentially the West Lothian question asks, why should Scottish MPs be able to vote on English matters in Parliament that do not affect their constituents, whilst English MPs cannot do the same to the Scottish Parliament? And it's a good question, and it's not one that's really been perfectly answered. Now, there was the Mackay Commission and its recommendations in 2013 that parliamentary procedure should be updated, and this is what happened. And so in October 2015, EVIL was introduced, with the creation of a Grand Committee stage. And so in this, the English MPs, or if it's a piece of legislation that affects England and Wales, English and Welsh MPs get a vote, and they can veto either a whole piece of legislation or bits of that legislation that only impact on England or only impact on England and Wales. However, these bills then do have to go on and pass the whole House at a third reading. So it's not really English votes for English laws, because you still can have Scottish MPs having the right to have a vote on it. SNP, generally speaking, say that they won't vote on things that don't affect Scotland, again indicating the idea of separating Scottish and English votes. It's first used in January 2016. Now, arguably, it creates a two-tier system of MPs, therefore it's having a significant impact. Because you've got Scottish MPs who don't get to vote on all laws that go through the Westminster Parliament, which seems to make them secondary to the English MPs. It also causes issues as well. Essentially, any law that involves substantive public spending in England arguably has an impact on elsewhere, because the pot only has so much money on it, and therefore the amount that's spent in England is then not available to be spent elsewhere. Now, the West Lothian question is possibly not been that huge an issue over recent years, because we have a Conservative government. Now, if we were to have a Labour government that was reliant on Scottish MPs to get things through Parliament, then this could well become a much bigger issue. So I think on the West Lothian question, in terms of impact through devolution, I think this is really a major point of watch this space. At the moment, not having that big an impact, because essentially the Conservatives don't really have any representation in Scotland, and therefore they're not reliant on Scottish votes to pass laws that only affect England anyway. If circumstances would change with some kind of Labour government, or maybe some kind of Labour SNP coalition even, then this would become a hugely significant issue again. The Scottish Parliament and Government. Well, this was created under the Scotland Act of 1998 following support in a referendum that not only supported the creation of a Scottish Parliament, but also giving it primary legislative and tax varying powers. There are 129 members of Scottish Parliament, 73 are elected using first past the post in single member constituencies, and 56 are additional members. They're elected out of 8 multi-member regions using a list system. With seats awarded in a proportional way, with a corrective calculation taking the seats of the single member constituencies into account to try and assure fairly proportional outcomes. This, generally speaking, has led to coalition governments. Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP leader, is currently the First Minister in Scotland. And the SNP are a minority government. They have 61 of the 129 seats. They had a majority with 69 seats back before 2016. They might well regain that when the elections happen in 2021, but again, until it's happened, we don't know. Nicola Sturgeon, in her time as SNP leader, has gained a huge amount of attention, not only with Scotland, but actually in terms of the whole UK, particularly in her appearances in the leaders' debates, but also in terms of her handling of the COVID crisis. And there have been stages where Boris Johnson seems to be copying her policies. I mean, this was most notable with the cancelling of exams, with the with the accepting of teachers' predicted grades, and these things all happened in Scotland before they happened in England, and so some would argue that she's come across a lot better through the last year than Johnson has. Now, the SNP are confident of a really strong performance in 2021, and we'll see if they do this again. Then we've got this idea of a push for independence. Now, part of the whole idea behind devolution in Scotland was to prevent the movement towards independence, and it's quite clear that hasn't really happened. The Scottish Parliament has considerable powers. Those have grown most notably with the Scotland Act of 2016, which gave the Scottish Parliament the ability to set income tax rates and where the income tax bands fell. The right to 50% of all VAT raised in Scotland, control over passenger duty, control over key welfare benefits, notably disability living allowance, the bedroom tax, the housing part of universal credit. They also have control over speed limits, rail franchises, fracking, and franchise to Scottish Parliament elections. Now, the Conservative government gave them these powers following the 2016 independence referendum, which voted no to independence, but was much closer than people expected. And since then, the SNP has gone on to dominate Scottish politics, winning a really high proportion of Scottish seats in Westminster, and also being the biggest party in the Scottish Parliament. Again, this was seen as an attempt to see off demands for independence. Again, it hasn't worked. The powers that the Scottish Parliament has, and we'll look at them in detail in a second, are quite extensive, but they fall short of what would be known as Devo Max, which would be essentially giving Scottish Parliament control over pretty much everything other than what absolutely essentially must be held at Westminster. And that Devo Max is the possible next step. Again, it is short of independence. There is, however, the possibility that the next step might well be independence. The Scottish Parliament now cannot be abolished without Scotland's consent through a referendum. But again, all this is just down in Acts of Parliament, which of course can be turned round. But again, it looks like the Scottish Parliament is very much here to stay unless Scotland decides to go for independence. So the powers that Scottish Parliament has, other than the ones we've already set out, so it has control over health and social policy, including the NHS, and we see free prescriptions in Scotland. We see other health issues, for example, minimum pricing on alcohol. They have control of social services. They have control over abortion law. In terms of the environment and other areas, they've got agriculture and fisheries, environment, economic development, local government, housing, planning, transport. In education, the Scottish school system is completely different, and that has been even before devolution. Their exam systems are different. They have control over university education, and notably Scottish students don't pay any fees. They have control over culture, language, sport, and tourism. They have a great deal of control in terms of law and home affairs. They have control over the police, over the justice system, over the prisons, and over elections. So the Scottish Parliament has the greatest level of power of any of the devolved bodies. And yet there is still that demand for independence, that demand for more. Now, one of the reasons why you'll see things in there that you won't see elsewhere or you definitely don't see in England, is something known as the Barnett formula, which is used to calculate the amount of public spending per head in the different parts of the UK, and the Barnett formula gives more money to Scotland than it does to England, for example. And so this does lead to some disparity, and again, this is another issue and something else which is having an impact following devolution, because we are seeing these disparities in some really big important policy areas in Scotland compared to the rest of England, and a lot of people in England turning around, well, how come they can have that and we can't? The Welsh Assembly in government, and it started as the Welsh Assembly, it's now the Welsh Parliament, and it started on really shaky grounds. It started with a tiny majority in favour, quite a low voter turnout, so it's about just over 25% of the population essentially voted in favour of devolution. It has gained power and credibility over time. In 2011, the referendum saw 64% of people who voting in favour of primary legislative powers. The 2017 Welsh Act gave the Welsh Assembly tax varying powers, control over assembly and local elections, control over fracking, rail franchise, and speed limits on the roads. The Act also opened the way to renaming the Assembly as the Parliament, which it now is. And so we've seen the Welsh Assembly start on fairly shaky grounds and grow and develop its powers and become the Welsh Parliament. And one of the things that's really interesting with this is obviously we're seeing some of this in 2017, which means this is happening under a Conservative government. So initially devolution was a Labour idea. We could see why the coalition government might be pushing along this route as well, with the Liberal Democrats on board. But the fact that Conservatives continued expanding devolution is really quite an interesting one. Again, shows the impact of the idea of devolution. So the Welsh Assembly has 60 members, 40 members elected on first past the post in single member constituencies, and 20 members that are selected from 5 multi-member constituencies using PR, again like in Scotland. This is overall an AMS system with a corrected formula to try and make it as proportional as possible. Labour has been the dominant power in the Welsh Assembly / Parliament all the way through, and has been in either power alone or in a coalition since 1999, which is the first time there was elections. The current First Minister is Mark Drakeford, who you might have seen again during the COVID crisis and delivering updates from Wales. He's a former professor of social policy and played a major role in the development of Wales's COVID response. And again, this has been quite a good way in the last year that has highlighted the differences. So Wales, again, it has done things differently in terms of exams in 2021. It's done things differently in terms of lockdowns, in terms of tier systems, all kind of things like that. So we are seeing differences in Wales than we are in England. So the Welsh Parliament and Government has control over 10p of income tax. Now, it's highly unlikely you'd have a variation or shift in income tax of more than 10p. So that essentially means the Welsh income tax rate can be different to that in England. In health and social services, they control the NHS, no prescription charges, they control social services. We've got the same similar ideas to in Scotland with environment, agriculture, economic development, local government, housing, planning, transport. In education, we've seen some variation. So, for example, there's no exams in summer 2021. Welsh students all sit ASs, so they didn't move to the linear A levels like they did in England. Also, another major thing you'd notice if you're in a Welsh school is that Welsh is compulsory to the age of 16. A slight variation in university education, notably the fees are slightly lower. They have control over culture and language, sport, tourism, and control over elections. Now, the Welsh Parliament wanted control over law and order, like the Scottish Parliament, and it was recommended in a Silk report to the government that that's what should happen. But the Conservative UK government said no, so they have less power than Scotland, but that is possibly due to the fact there is less demand in Wales for independence. So the major difference here seems to be not necessarily about the strength of belief in devolution from the government, but whether they're worried about the UK breaking up. Northern Ireland, the Assembly and the Executive of Northern Ireland, now this is a different story really to the other ones that we've seen, because it's in very different circumstances. So it's created following the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which was a kind of a real breakthrough in the peace process in Northern Ireland. It was aiming to end communal conflict within Northern Ireland between the nationalist and unionist communities, and establish an idea of power sharing between these two groups. Now, Northern Ireland, different to the rest of the UK, has its own political parties that represent the two communities. So mainly, you've got the DUP and the UUP, so the Ulster Unionist Party, who represent the Unionists, and then you've got the Sinn Féin and the SDLP who represent the nationalist community. The Northern Ireland Assembly is made up of 108 members, and they're elected by a single transferable vote. And the elections are every 5 years. It was every 4, and it's been moved to every 5 years since 2011. And the idea of STV is it gives really proportional outcomes, and that means that you've got proportional representation of the two communities. The executive, then, this has also got a degree of proportionality in it, which is a really interesting idea in the way that it's run. So the executive is led by the First Minister, who is the leader of the biggest party in the Assembly. The Deputy First Minister is the leader of the second biggest party. And what's generally happened is that the leader of the biggest party has been from the Unionist community. The Deputy First Minister has then been from a nationalist party. And then ministerial positions are allocated on a proportional system. Again, so you've got an executive that is made up of different parties from different communities. Now, the Assembly and the Executive stopped functioning in 2017. Essentially, they couldn't agree on come to a power sharing agreement, and it didn't restart until January 2020. And in those kind of interleading 3 years, we went back to a period of direct rule from Westminster. So therefore, we had for a period of time and very limited impact of devolution because it wasn't functioning. Now, Northern Ireland's devolution is more tricky. It is therefore more volatile and a very different system to the one we've seen set up elsewhere. So the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive has control over corporation tax, it has control over health and social policy, notably the NHS, social services, some welfare benefits, similar control to Wales and Scotland in terms of agriculture, environment, economic development, local government, housing, planning and transport, similar again in terms of schools, university education, culture and language, sport and tourism. Schools are very different again in Northern Ireland, largely faith-based schools. Though there's some degree of decline in that. Their control over law and home affairs, police, justice, prisons and elections, and that was hugely significant. Part of it, again, because of the history between the two communities and issues with British rule going back into the 60s and 70s. Direct rule period in between 2017 and 2020 saw same-sex marriage being legalised and also liberalisation of abortion laws. Now, again, the future and the long-term impact of devolution in Northern Ireland is really going to depend on the attitude of the two communities. Well, one thing we have seen is a notable shift in the voting, so that probably the two most extreme parties, the DUP and Sinn Féin, have been the two parties that have become the biggest. So this idea that the communities they would move to more the moderate middle, it hasn't happened as yet. Attitudes are also likely to shift as demographics shift. So there is a Protestant unionist majority in Northern Ireland, but again, in the long term, that may well not always remain to be the case. So overall, there is a real big impact in terms of devolution, because we can see the huge number of areas of power and responsibility that have been moved to these different institutions. The impact in England is probably the most hard to pin down because it is so variable. It just varies from where you live to the degree of devolution you get. And also, it's one of those bits from England. It's being on the outside looking in, really, because you're kind of staring at the evolved powers that other places have got and thinking, yeah, why don't we have those? And English votes for English laws has not been properly sorted out. So in terms of the future of devolution, probably the next bit to go is going to be England. There needs maybe some kind of more unified or better thought out system for England in terms of devolution. The impact in Scotland was supposed to be to kind of play down or reverse demands for independence. Well, actually, what we've seen is the opposite happening since the late 1990s. And therefore, that might also be the next chapter. Then this might be Scotland moving to Devo Max, or it might be Scotland leaving the UK altogether. So devolution has spoken about Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson talked about it being a terrible idea and it potentially leading to the breakup of the UK, when actually its intention was the complete opposite. Now, that was largely him aiming criticism at the SNP rather than at the system altogether. so he claimed afterwards. But we can see devolution has remained a highly controversial issue. I hope this video has been useful for you. If it has been, then please hit like. If you have any questions or queries or any comments about devolution, then please add in the comment box. If you haven't done so already, then please subscribe. In particular, if you are studying A-level politics and you want to get notifications as I add more and more videos, as I aim to cover the entirety of the specification. There is already everything, all the different bullet points from Unit 1 covered, or Component 1 covered. I'm currently working my way through Component 2, which is this is part of, and I'm also working my way through Component 3 on US government and politics. So if those bits interest you, if you're studying those, then make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and get notifications as I add more and more videos. Thank you very much for watching.